The hospital corridor was too bright for what Jose Alvarez was doing. In front of nurses, a billing clerk, and his own relatives, he pointed toward the exit and told his wife to leave. His voice was controlled, almost polite, as he called her unnecessary. Said she had no place near his mother. No one stopped him. Alexandra Reed didn't argue. She didn't explain. She simply looked at him for a moment, then turned away. Upstairs, behind sealed doors and sterile light, the surgical team was already preparing for a procedure only one doctor in that hospital could lead, and her name was already on the board. If you believe dignity matters most when no one else speaks, stay with this story. Tell me where you're watching from and your local time. And if stories like this mean something to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Chicago carried its own rhythm in the early hours, a quiet tension that lived between glass towers and hospital corridors. Inside St. Gabriel Medical Center, that rhythm never stopped. It only changed pace. Alexandra Reed had learned to move with it years ago. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. She moved with the kind of precision that came from repetition, from discipline, from a mind that did not allow itself the luxury of distraction by the time most of the city was still deciding whether to wake. Alexandra had already completed a 6-hour surgery and dictated her post-operative notes with exacting clarity. There was nothing dramatic about her work. No raised voices, no visible strain, just decisions made at the right moment with the right hand under the right light. People trusted that kind of silence. They trusted it without always understanding it. In the hospital, her name carried weight, though it was rarely spoken loudly. Among residents and senior staff, it moved in quieter ways. A look exchanged in a hallway. A note left untouched because it was already correct. A case reassigned without explanation because someone higher up knew exactly who needed to handle it. Alexandra did not ask for that recognition. She did not build her identity around it. Outside the hospital, she allowed it to disappear entirely. Jose Alvarez preferred it that way. Their apartment overlooked the river high enough to make the city feel distant, but not so high that it lost its sound. From the outside, it suggested stability. Clean lines, neutral tones, carefully chosen furniture that implied intention without excess. Inside, the balance was less certain. Jose stood near the kitchen counter that morning. Scrolling through his phone, the glow of the screen reflected faintly in his eyes. He wore confidence easily, the kind that came from being heard often enough that he no longer questioned whether he should be. "You got in late again," he said, not looking up. It was not a question. Alexandra set her bag down near the entryway. She did not answer immediately. She removed her watch, placed it in the same spot she always did, and walked toward the sink to wash her hands. The motion was habitual, almost automatic, but it also gave her a moment. "I told you I had a case," she said finally. Jose exhaled through his nose, a quiet sound that carried more meaning than volume. "You always have a case." There was no anger in his tone. Not yet. Just a steady undercurrent of dismissal, as if the explanation itself had already failed before it was offered. Alexandra dried her hands and turned slightly, not fully facing him. "It was an emergency." "They're all emergencies," Jose replied, now looking at her. "That's the point, right?" He smiled faintly, as though he had made a reasonable observation. As though this was a conversation built on equal footing, Alexandra did not challenge him. She had learned that corrections, even gentle ones, did not land where they should. They shifted. They returned, altered. They became something else entirely. Instead, she nodded once. Not agreement, not surrender, just acknowledgement that the words had been spoken. Jose returned to his phone. The conversation ended without resolution, which was how most of them ended. Carmen Alvarez believed that silence was a form of distance. She had believed it from the beginning. "She doesn't know how to be part of a family." Carmen had once set her voice low enough to suggest discretion, but clear enough that it carried. Everything is clinical with her. Even the way she looks at people. They had been sitting at a long dining table, then polished wood reflecting the overhead light. Alexandra remembered the way the glasses had been arranged, the precise alignment of silverware, the small details that seemed to matter more in that room than the conversation itself. Jose had not corrected his mother. He had not agreed either. He had simply continued eating. Alexandra had noticed. She always noticed. Carmen valued presence. Not physical presence alone, but emotional availability expressed in ways she recognized. Conversations that lingered, reactions that matched expectations, a certain warmth that could be seen and measured. Alexandra's version of care did not look like that. It was quieter, more deliberate. It showed up in different forms, in remembering exact details of someone's medical history, in adjusting her schedule to accommodate a family dinner, even if it meant losing sleep, in standing still when others needed space instead of filling it with words. But those forms were not visible to Carmen. And what was not visible in that family often became suspect. Over time, the gap widened. Jose did not bridge it. He managed it. That was how he saw himself. Not as a source of tension, but as someone navigating it. Someone who had to balance a demanding career, a complicated family, and a wife who, in his view, refused to meet him halfway. He did not consider that his definition of halfway might not be shared. He did not consider that Alexandra had been standing still long enough for him to move. That morning, Carmen had called just before noon. Alexandra was still at the hospital reviewing imaging in a consultation room when her phone vibrated against the table. She glanced at the screen. Carmen's name appeared briefly before disappearing into silence. Alexandra let it go to voicemail, not out of avoidance, out of necessity. She finished reviewing the scans, made a note for a resident, and stepped into the hallway. The hospital around her was steady, controlled each movement, part of a larger system that functioned because people respected its structure. She listened to the voicemail only after she reached a quieter corner. Alexandra Carmen's voice said tight but composed. "I need you to remind Jose about dinner tonight. He's been forgetting things again, and I don't want any last-minute excuses." There was a pause. "And try to come on time this time." The message ended. Alexandra looked at the screen for a moment longer than necessary. Then she placed the phone back into her pocket and returned to work. She did not respond. Not immediately. By late afternoon, the sky over Chicago had shifted, the light flattening against the buildings as if the city itself was holding its breath. Inside the hospital, that change meant nothing. Time was measured differently there. Alexandra was walking between departments when the call came through. This time, it was not Carmen. It was an emergency line. The voice on the other end was urgent, stripped of anything unnecessary. Female, late 60s, suspected aortic rupture. ETA 5 minutes. Alexandra did not ask for the name. She did not need to. Her body had already adjusted. Her pace changed. Not faster, but more direct. Every step aligned with what needed to happen next. By the time the gurney came through the doors, Alexandra was already there. And when she saw Carmen Alvarez on that stretcher, pale, barely conscious, surrounded by controlled urgency, she did not hesitate. She did not speak Jose's name. She did not think about the dinner. She stepped forward, eyes sharp, voice steady. Get her to imaging, now. The system moved. Around her, everything fell into place. And somewhere far outside the structure of that moment, a different kind of collision was already beginning to form. One that had nothing to do with medicine, and everything to do with what people chose to see. The emergency department did not slow down for recognition. It absorbed it, adjusted around it, and kept moving. By the time Carmen Alvarez was transferred from the gurney to the imaging table, the room had already shifted into a tighter configuration. Voices lowered. Movements sharpened. The casual rhythm of the hallway gave way to something more exact. Alexandra Reed stood at the foot of the table, her attention fixed not on the person, but on the pattern. Blood pressure unstable, skin tone fading, breathing shallow, uneven. The kind of presentation that did not leave space for hesitation. "Contrast ready?" she asked. A technician nodded. "Ready, run it." The machine came alive with a low mechanical hum, the kind that usually faded into the background. Not now. Now every sound seemed to anchor the moment. Alexandra watched the monitor as the first images appeared. She did not lean in. She did not step back. She simply observed her expression unchanged as the details revealed themselves layer by layer. There it was, a tear along the aortic wall. Not complete, not yet, but unstable, expanding. Time in cases like this was not measured in minutes. It was measured in decisions, page cardiothoracic. Alexandra said, her voice even. "Prep or, this is surgical." The words carried weight, but she did not raise her tone. She didn't need to. Around her, the system responded. Footsteps accelerated. Phones lifted. Orders transmitted. Carmen shifted slightly on the table, a faint movement that suggested awareness more than consciousness. Her eyes opened just enough to register light shapes, fragments of sound. For a brief second, they landed on Alexandra. Recognition flickered. Not of the surgeon, of the woman she had never quite accepted. Carmen's lips parted as if to say something. Nothing came out. Alexandra held her gaze for exactly 1 moment longer than necessary. Then she turned back to the monitor. "Let's move," she said. Jose Alvarez arrived 8 minutes later. He did not walk into the emergency department. He entered it. There was a difference. His pace was fast, his posture forward, his voice already carrying before he reached the desk. "My mother, Carmen Alvarez. They said she was brought in. Where is she?" The nurse behind the counter maintained eye contact, her tone measured. "She's currently in evaluation. Are you immediate family? I'm her son." Jose said, already stepping around the barrier as if the confirmation was a formality. "Sir," the nurse added, "standing now you'll need to wait." But Jose was no longer listening. Panic had a way of narrowing his focus. It stripped away patience, replaced it with urgency that felt justified in the moment, even when it wasn't. He moved down the hallway following the direction of activity, the cluster of staff that marked where something serious was happening. He saw the movement first, then the equipment. Then, through the partial opening of a door, he saw Alexandra. For a second, his mind did not connect the image to reality. She stood among the staff, her posture aligned with theirs, her attention fixed, her presence unhesitating. She was not at the edge of the room. She was not waiting to be told what to do. She was already part of it. Jose's confusion lasted only a moment. Then it shifted. What is she doing here? The question came out sharper than intended, but he did not correct it. A nearby nurse glanced at him, then back toward the room. "Sir, you can't be in this area." "That's my wife," Jose said, gesturing toward Alexandra, as if that explained everything. She shouldn't be in there. She's not." He stopped, because even he realized mid-sentence that he did not have the word, not one that fit the situation unfolding in front of him. Inside the room, Alexandra did not turn. If she heard him, she gave no indication. Her focus remained where it needed to be. "Vitals?" she asked. Dropping someone, replied, "Get anesthesia ready. We're not waiting." The decision was immediate, clean, final. Jose stepped forward again, his voice rising. "Alexandra." This time a hand came to his chest, firm, controlled. "Sir, you need to step back," the nurse said. "That's my mother," he insisted, his tone shifting from confusion to something closer to anger. "And that's my wife. I have a right to know what's going on." "You'll be updated," the nurse replied. "Right now, the team is working." "The team?" Jose looked past her again, at Alexandra, at the way no one questioned her, at the way the room seemed to organize itself around her presence. It did not make sense, not within the framework he had built. Because in his version of things, Alexandra was always adjacent, always secondary, always somewhere just outside the center of action. That version did not hold here, and instead of adjusting it, he resisted. "She needs to come out," he said more forcefully now. "She's not involved in this." The nurse did not respond immediately. She didn't need to. The situation itself contradicted him. Inside the room, Alexandra gave another instruction. "Call her to. Clear it." A voice responded, "Yes, doctor. Doctor." The word landed, but not where it should have. Jose heard it. He just didn't accept it. Minutes stretched in ways that felt uneven. Carmen was stabilized just enough for transfer. Lines secured. Monitoring continuous. Movement controlled. Alexandra walked alongside the gurney as it moved toward the surgical wing, her pace matched to its speed. She did not look back. Behind her, the hallway filled briefly with overlapping motion. Jose followed. This time, no one stopped him immediately. Not because he was allowed, but because attention was elsewhere. He kept his distance just enough to observe, not enough to interrupt. The closer they moved toward the restricted area, the more defined the boundaries became. Doors that required access. Staff that did not look up unless necessary. A shift from public urgency to private precision. At the threshold, Alexandra stopped. She turned slightly, speaking to a resident. "Prep consent forms. Notify Dr. Bennett." The resident nodded and moved quickly. Jose closed the remaining distance. "Alexandra." His voice was lower now, tighter. She looked at him, not with surprise, not with irritation, just recognition. "You need to leave this area," she said. It was not personal. It was procedural. Jose stared at her, searching for something familiar in her tone. Something that matched the conversations they had at home. It wasn't there. "This is my mother," he said. "You don't get to tell me to leave." Alexandra held his gaze for a moment. Then she shifted it slightly, just enough to include the nurse standing nearby. "He'll need to be directed to the waiting area," she said. The phrasing was deliberate. Not "you need to leave." He'll need to be directed. It placed the responsibility on the system, not on the relationship. Jose felt it, even if he didn't fully understand it. "I'm not going anywhere," he replied. Behind him, footsteps approached. Security quiet, but present. The hospital had its own way of enforcing boundaries. Alexandra turned back to the gurney. "Let's move," she said. And the doors opened, then closed, leaving Jose on the outside. For the first time, the space between what he believed and what was actually happening began to widen. He did not step back, not yet. But something small and unsteady had already shifted, and it would not return to where it had been. The waiting area outside the surgical wing was designed to soften reality. Muted colors, upholstered chairs arranged in quiet symmetry, a coffee station that no one truly used, soft lighting that attempted to disguise the sharpness of what people were actually there for. It worked sometimes. Not today. Jose Alvarez did not sit. He stood near the glass partition that separated the public hallway from the restricted corridor, his reflection faintly layered over the movement behind it. Staff passed through with measured urgency badges, scanned doors opening and closing in controlled intervals. Every time they opened, he looked for her. Every time they closed, he found nothing. Diane Alvarez arrived 20 minutes later, her steps slower but more deliberate. She took in the scene before speaking, her gaze moving from Jose's rigid posture to the closed doors and back again. "What happened?" she asked. Jose exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "They took her in. Something with her heart." "They're not telling me anything." Diane's expression tightened, and Alexandra Jose hesitated. The question should have been simple. It wasn't. "She's here," he said finally. "Somewhere in there." Diane followed his line of sight to the restricted doors. "Good," she said quietly. "At least she showed up." Jose turned toward her, something sharper in his eyes now. "That's not the point." Diane didn't respond immediately. She had known Jose long enough to recognize when he was not ready to hear anything that contradicted him. Instead, she sat down, folding her hands in her lap, her posture composed but attentive. Jose began pacing. It wasn't a large space, but he used all of it. Back and forth steps, measured at first, then less so. His thoughts moved faster than his body, circling the same point without landing. He had seen Alexandra in that room. He had heard the word, doctor. But it didn't fit. Not with the version of her he carried. Not with the conversations they had, the arguments, the dismissals, the quiet ways he had placed her work below everything else that mattered. If she were really no. He stopped the thought before it could complete. The alternative required too much adjustment. It required him to reconsider not just this moment, but everything leading up to it. And Jose Alvarez did not adjust easily. A nurse approached, then her expression professional, her tone carefully neutral. "Mr. Alvarez." Jose turned immediately. "Yes, I'm her son. What's happening? Your mother is being prepared for surgery," the nurse said. "The surgical team is currently reviewing her case." Jose nodded, impatient. "Then I need to speak to whoever's in charge." The nurse held his gaze. "You'll be updated as soon as the team is ready to speak with you." "That's not what I asked," Jose replied, his voice tightening. "I want to know who's making decisions." There was a pause. Not long, but enough. "The attending surgeon will be assigned based on availability and specialization," the nurse said. "You'll be informed shortly." Jose took a step closer. "And my wife?" The nurse's expression did not change, but something in her posture did. A subtle shift, a recalibration. "Dr. Reed is part of the team," she said. The words landed cleanly, without emphasis, without explanation. Jose blinked once. Part of the team. It was not the same as being in charge. It was not the same as... He nodded slowly, as if accepting the statement at face value, even as something inside him resisted it. "Fine," he said. "Then tell her to come out." The nurse did not move. "She's currently preparing for the procedure," she replied. "She's not available." Jose let out a short, humorless breath. "She can step out for a minute. This is her family." The nurse's tone remained steady. "Right now she's acting in a professional capacity." There it was again. Professional. Jose's jaw tightened. "That doesn't override this," he said, gesturing vaguely between himself and the closed doors. "She doesn't get to just ignore me." Diane looked up, then her voice calm but firm. "Jose," he didn't turn. "She's working," Diane continued. "Let her do her job." Jose laughed, but there was no amusement in it. "You don't even know what her job is." Diane held his gaze. "Do you?" The question hung there, unanswered, uncomfortable. Jose looked away first. Before Diane could say anything more, the doors to the restricted corridor opened. Two physicians stepped out, their expressions composed, their attention focused. Behind them, Alexandra emerged. She had changed. Not dramatically, but enough. The coat, the posture, the stillness that now felt less like restraint and more like control. Jose moved toward her immediately. Finally, he said, his voice carrying just enough to draw attention from those nearby. "We need to talk." Alexandra stopped a few feet away, not close enough to suggest intimacy, not far enough to avoid engagement. "There's nothing to discuss right now," she said. Her tone was even, measured, the same tone she had used inside. Jose's frustration sharpened. "That's my mother in there. And she's being prepared for surgery," Alexandra replied. "Time matters." Jose shook his head. "You don't get to decide that." Alexandra did not react. She did not raise her voice. She did not step back. "I'm part of the surgical team," she said. The words were simple, but they shifted the air around them. Jose felt it, even if he still resisted what it meant. "That's not enough," he said quickly. "I want to speak to whoever's actually in charge." There was a brief silence. Then Alexandra answered, "I am." The statement did not rise. It settled. Diane's eyes moved from Alexandra to Jose, watching the realization begin to form, uneven and incomplete. Jose stared at her, searching for contradiction, for hesitation, for anything that would allow him to dismiss what she had just said. He found nothing. "That's not possible," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. Alexandra held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Then she shifted her attention slightly enough to include the physicians standing behind her. "We don't have time for this," she said. "The consent needs to be addressed." Jose stepped forward again, his voice rising now, the control slipping. "You don't get to make that call without me." A few heads turned. The waiting area, designed for quiet, absorbed the tension but did not conceal it. Alexandra did not lower her voice. She didn't need to. "In emergency cases," she said, "the hospital proceeds under standard of care protocols if immediate consent cannot be obtained without risking the patient." Jose's expression hardened. "I'm right here, and you're being informed," she replied. It was precise, it was accurate, and it left no room for interpretation. Jose looked around, suddenly aware of the eyes on him. Staff, other families, observers who did not know the full story but understood enough. The shift in power was not loud, but it was visible. He felt it, and he rejected it. "You're not doing this," he said louder now. "You're not going to use this too." He stopped himself, but the implication lingered. Alexandra did not respond to it. She did not engage with the accusation. Instead, she turned slightly toward the nurse standing nearby. "Please have him escorted to the waiting area if he continues to interfere," she said. The phrasing was calm, formal, final. Jose stared at her, something between disbelief and anger, settling into something heavier. For the first time, there was no space for him to redefine the moment. No room to adjust the narrative. Only the reality in front of him. And the quiet certainty in Alexandra's voice. She turned back toward the doors. "Prep the OR," she said. And then she walked away. Not quickly, not slowly, just forward, leaving Jose standing exactly where he was. And for the first time without control over what happened next. The doors to operating room 2 closed with a soft, controlled seal that erased the waiting area from existence. Inside, the air shifted. It always did. Sound flattened into purpose. Movement aligned. Every object had a place, every motion a sequence. The world beyond those doors did not disappear, but it lost its influence. It became irrelevant to the work at hand. Alexandra Reed stood at the scrub sink, sleeves rolled just below her elbows, hands positioned under a steady stream of water. The process was methodical. Fingertips first, palms, wrists. Each motion timed, each angle deliberate. She did not rush. She did not pause. Across from her doctor, Richard Bennett watched without speaking. He had seen surgeons rush before. He had seen hesitation too. Both left marks in places that could not afford them. Alexandra left neither. "You disclosed the relationship," he said. Finally, his tone low, conversational in a way that did not interrupt the rhythm of the room. "Yes. No prior involvement in her treatment plan. None. Financial dependency between you and the family." Alexandra rinsed, allowing the water to run clean before answering. "Joint accounts. No shared liabilities tied to this procedure." Bennett nodded once. The questions were not personal. They were structural, necessary. Behind them, Laura Whitman stood just inside the boundary of the sterile field tablet in hand, reviewing documentation that had already been cross-checked twice. "The emergency exception applies," she said. "Time-sensitive intervention. No viable delay for alternate assignment without increasing mortality risk." Her voice carried clarity without urgency. It was not a decision made lightly, but it had been made. Bennett shifted his gaze briefly toward Alexandra. "You understand the scrutiny this will bring?" "I do." "Then you proceed knowing every action will be reviewed." Alexandra turned off the water. "Yes." There was no hesitation in the answer, because hesitation would have been the only real concern. In the waiting area, time did not move the same way. Jose Alvarez checked his watch for the third time in as many minutes, though he could not have said what he expected to change between each glance. The second hand moved. The numbers remained constant. Diane sat where she had been, her posture unchanged, her attention focused not on the clock, but on Jose himself. "You should sit down," she said quietly. "I'm fine." He wasn't. The tension in his shoulders had not eased. If anything, it had tightened, pulling his frame inward, narrowing his focus even further. "They can't just shut me out." He continued, more to himself than to her. "That's not how this works." Diane watched him for a moment before responding. "It might be." Jose shook his head. "No. I'm her son. I have a right to what Diane asked, not sharply, but with enough precision to interrupt him." Jose stopped. The question was not confrontational. It was exact. "To know what's happening," he said after a moment. "You do," Diane replied. "She needs surgery. That's not enough." Diane leaned back slightly, her gaze steady. "Then maybe it's not about information." Jose's expression hardened. "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means," Diane said, choosing her words carefully, "that you're used to being part of the decision." Jose didn't respond. Because she wasn't wrong. He had built his life around that assumption, that his presence carried weight, that his voice shaped outcomes, even in situations he didn't fully understand, especially then. "And right now," Diane continued, "you're not." Jose looked away. The statement did not sit well, not because it was unclear, but because it was. Inside the operating room, Alexandra stepped into her gown as a nurse secured the ties with practiced efficiency. Gloves followed. The sterile field was established, the instruments arranged in exact alignment. Carmen Alvarez lay at the center of it, all her body still, her condition held in a narrow balance between intervention and collapse. Anesthesiology confirmed sedation levels. Monitors stabilized into a pattern that could be read, interpreted, trusted within limits. Alexandra took her position. There was no announcement, no formal declaration of authority. There didn't need to be. "Scalpel," she said. The instrument was placed into her hand before the final syllable had fully settled. Her focus narrowed, not to exclusion, but to precision. Every variable accounted for, every movement anticipated. The incision was clean, measured, exactly where it needed to be. Around her, the team moved in synchrony. No wasted motion, no unnecessary words. Bennett observed from across the table, not intervening, but present in a way that ensured oversight without disruption. Time in that room became elastic. Minutes stretched, compressed, lost their usual meaning. Only sequence mattered. Only outcome. In the hallway outside, a quiet conversation unfolded between two nurses near the station. He didn't know, one of them asked, her voice low. The other shook her head slightly. Doesn't seem like it. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Both of them had seen enough to understand the imbalance, not just of knowledge, but of perception. Dr. Reed's on lead, the first nurse asked. Of course, the second replied. There's no one better for this case. The statement carried no exaggeration, just fact, and facts in that environment tended to surface eventually. Jose's phone buzzed. He looked at it immediately, expecting an update, a call, something that would return him to a position of clarity. It was a message. Not from the hospital, from his bank. He frowned slightly, opening it without thinking. A notification, unusual activity review. He dismissed it almost instantly. Not now. Whatever it was could wait. He returned his attention to the doors, to the silence, to the absence of control that pressed against him more with each passing minute. Inside, Alexandra adjusted her position slightly, her eyes tracking the progression of the repair. Pressure, she asked. Stable, came the response. For now. She did not acknowledge the qualification. She didn't need to. She had already accounted for it. A slight shift in tissue, a change in flow, variables adjusting in real time. Her hands moved accordingly. No hesitation, no excess, just correction. This was where she existed most clearly. Not in conversation, not in explanation. Here, where outcomes were not argued, they were built. Hours would pass before the doors opened again, before the waiting area shifted from uncertainty to something else. But even now, long before that moment arrived, the direction had already been set. Not by volume, not by demand, but by quiet, deliberate action. And in that difference, something irreversible had begun. The operating room held its own version of time, but outside, memory moved more freely. For Alexandra Reed, it did not arrive as a single recollection. It unfolded in fragments, layered between actions, threaded through the steady rhythm of her work. Not as distraction, but as context. A quiet ledger of everything that had led to this moment. She had never intended to keep records, at least not in the beginning. In the early months of her marriage to Jose Alvarez, she had believed what most people believed when they stepped into something new, that adjustments would be mutual, that misunderstandings would resolve themselves with time, that respect, once assumed, would remain intact. The first time he dismissed her work, it had sounded casual. "You're always tired," Jose had said one evening, leaning back against the couch as she reviewed notes at the dining table. "It's not like you're the only one with a job." He had smiled when he said it. Not cruelly, not even seriously, just enough to suggest that the statement didn't need to be examined. Alexandra had looked up briefly, considered responding, then returned to her notes. It wasn't worth correcting, at least not then. Moments like that rarely stood alone. They repeated, subtle at first, then less so. "Can't you switch shifts?" he asked another time, standing in the doorway of their bedroom while she prepared for an overnight call. "We had plans." "It's not that kind of schedule," she replied, her tone even. Jose frowned slightly, as if the explanation were unnecessarily complicated. "Everything's negotiable, if you actually try." Alexandra had paused then, not because she didn't understand his perspective, but because she recognized the pattern forming. It wasn't about the schedule. It was about control. Not in the overt sense. Not in a way that could be easily named. but in expectations, in the assumption that her responsibilities were flexible while his were fixed, that her time could be adjusted to accommodate his, but not the other way around. She had not argued. Instead, she began to document. At first, it was incidental, a forwarded email she chose not to delete, a message thread she archived rather than dismissed, a calendar entry she left intact even after plans had changed. Not because she anticipated needing them, but because something in her understood that clarity, when challenged, required evidence. Jose did not notice, or if he did not interpret it correctly. He saw her silence as agreement, her lack of confrontation as absence of objection. Carmen Alvarez saw something else entirely. She doesn't react, Carmen had said once, her voice measured, but edged with disapproval. It's like talking to a wall. They had been in the kitchen, the afternoon light filtering through half-drawn blinds. Alexandra stood at the counter preparing something simple, her movements precise, unhurried. Jose leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. She just processes things differently, he said. It sounded like a defense. It wasn't. It was an explanation without support. Carmen shook her head slightly. No, she withholds. That's different. Alexandra continued slicing the knife, moving in clean, even strokes. She did not interrupt. She did not correct. But she remembered. Every word, every tone, not as grievance, as data. Over time, the records expanded. Financial statements became part of it, not out of suspicion at first, out of necessity. Joint accounts required oversight. Shared expenses needed tracking. It was practical, until it wasn't. Jose had a way of spending that did not align with his explanations. Small inconsistencies at first. A charge that didn't match a conversation. A transfer that appeared without context. When Alexandra asked, his responses were quick. It's nothing. I covered something for a friend. I'll explain later. Later rarely came. Alexandra did not press. Instead, she began to compare. Statements against timelines, transactions against messages. Patterns emerged, not dramatic, but consistent, enough to suggest intention. She saved those too, quietly, without confrontation. Because confrontation, she had learned, shifted the narrative. It turned specifics into arguments, evidence into interpretation. And Alexandra preferred precision, even in silence. Back in the present, her hands moved with the same discipline. The repair was progressing, but not without resistance. Tissue under strain, flow requiring adjustment, variables that demanded constant recalibration. Clamp, she said. The instrument was placed into her hand without delay. Her focus did not waver. But somewhere beneath that focus, the past continued to align itself. Not as distraction, as reinforcement. Every moment that had been minimized, every detail that had been overlooked. Every instance where her presence had been reduced to something secondary. All of it existed here, not emotionally, structurally, as part of the reason she did not hesitate now. In the waiting area, Jose sat for the first time. Not because he had chosen to, because standing no longer felt stable. His phone rested in his hand, the earlier notification still unread beyond its initial glance. He opened it again this time, with less urgency. Unusual activity review. A flagged transaction. He frowned, scrolling briefly. The amount wasn't unfamiliar. The account was a secondary account, one he had opened months ago. Separate, unshared. He had not expected it to draw attention. Not like this. Jose closed the message quickly, his thumb pressing the screen harder than necessary. This wasn't the time. Whatever the issue was, it could be handled later. Everything could be handled later. Once this was over, once his mother was stable, once things returned to something resembling normal, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, gaze fixed on the floor. He did not notice Diane watching him. Not directly, but closely enough to see the shift, the distraction, the brief fracture in his focus. "What is it?" she asked. Jose shook his head. Nothing. Diane didn't push. She didn't need to. She had seen enough over the years to recognize when something was being minimized, and how often that minimization came at a cost. Inside the operating room, Alexandra adjusted her position again. "Flow?" she asked. Improving, came the reply. It wasn't certainty, but it was movement in the right direction. She continued. Step by step, no deviation, no unnecessary motion. This was where everything converged. Skill, discipline, memory. Not the kind that lingered, the kind that informed, guided, ensured that nothing was overlooked. Because overlooking in her experience was where failure began. Not in the dramatic moments, in the small ones, the ones dismissed too quickly, the ones not recorded, not remembered, not accounted for. Alexandra accounted for everything. And in doing so, she moved through the procedure with the same quiet certainty that had defined her long before this moment. Outside, the world waited. Inside, the outcome was being built, one precise decision at a time. Carmen Alvarez's condition did not improve in a straight line. It never did with cases like this. Inside operating room 2, the monitors held a fragile pattern that could not be trusted for long. Numbers stabilized, then dipped. Pressure corrected, then drifted. Each adjustment bought time, but none of it guaranteed anything beyond the next sequence of decisions. Alexandra Reed did not expect stability. She expected movement. "Update," she said, her voice even beneath the low hum of machines. "Pressure holding for now," the anesthesiologist replied. "But she's not tolerating fluctuation well." "She won't," Alexandra said. "Not at this stage." There was no frustration in her tone, just recognition. She adjusted her stance slightly, her focus narrowing further as the repair progressed into a more delicate phase. Tissue integrity remained unpredictable. One miscalculation here would not be immediate failure, but it would set off a chain that could not be reversed. "Prepare for secondary reinforcement," she added. A nurse nodded, already moving. Across the table, Dr. Richard Bennett observed without interruption, his attention fixed not only on the procedure, but on Alexandra's decision-making. This was the point where experience separated itself from training, where instinct built over years determined whether a surgeon anticipated the next complication or reacted too late. So far, Alexandra anticipated. Every time. Outside, the hospital's internal system continued its own process. Not visible to families, not immediate, but constant. In a glass-walled conference room 2 floors below, Laura Whitman sat across from a risk management officer and a compliance coordinator. A digital file remained open on the table between them, its contents expanding with each logged report. Incident occurred at approximately 14:12, the coordinator said, referencing the timeline. Verbal escalation in a restricted medical environment, witnessed by multiple staff. Laura nodded once. Security footage, already flagged. Audio partially captured. Preserve all records, she said. No edits, no summaries yet. The instruction was precise. Documentation at this stage required accuracy over interpretation. Any direct interference with care? Laura asked. Not physical, the coordinator replied, but repeated attempts to access restricted areas and disrupt staff communication. Laura made a note. Then it qualifies for internal review, she said. Separate from the surgical outcome, the distinction mattered. Whatever happened in the operating room would stand on its own. But what had happened outside, it would not disappear. Back in the waiting area, the air had shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. The initial urgency had settled into something quieter, heavier. Conversations dropped to lower tones, movements slowed. The reality of waiting began to take hold. Jose Alvarez sat forward. His hands clasped, his gaze fixed somewhere between the floor and the closed doors ahead. He had stopped pacing. Not because he was calm, because pacing no longer changed anything. Diane remained nearby, her presence steady, her silence intentional. She had not pressed him since their last exchange. She had not needed to. Jose's thoughts were no longer linear. They moved in fragments. Alexandra in the emergency room. Her voice, her posture, the way no one questioned her. The word, doctor. He had heard it before. Of course he had. In passing. In conversations he had not fully listened to. In introductions he had not taken seriously. But he had never connected it to her. Not in a way that required understanding. Because understanding would have required adjustment. And adjustment would have required him to admit that something fundamental in his perception had been wrong. Jose shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening slightly. That doesn't make sense, he said almost to himself. Diane glanced at him. What doesn't? He shook his head. He stopped. Because the sentence could not be completed without exposing the gap. She never told me. But that wasn't entirely true. She had spoken. He just hadn't listened. Or rather, he had heard without absorbing. Filtered her words through his own expectations until they lost their original meaning. Diane watched him carefully. You didn't ask, she said. Jose looked up sharply. That's not... He stopped again, because the objection lacked substance. Diane didn't push further. She simply held his gaze long enough for the realization to settle, however slightly. Inside the operating room, the situation tightened. Pressure dropping, the anesthesiologist said more urgently now. Alexandra's focus did not break. Compensate, she replied. We're not done yet. Her hands moved with increased precision, adjusting for the shift without hesitation. The reinforcement phase required exact alignment. Too much tension and the tissue would fail. Too little and the repair would not hold. There was no margin for approximation. Hold suction, she instructed. A nurse responded immediately. The room narrowed further. Every movement now carried amplified consequence. Bennett stepped closer, not intervening, but positioning himself where oversight became more direct. You're close, he said quietly. I know, Alexandra replied. Her voice did not rise. But something in it sharpened. Not urgency, clarity. This was the point where outcomes diverged, where preparation met execution without buffer. She adjusted again. A fraction. Enough, now, she said. The final sequence began. In the hallway outside, two nurses paused briefly near the station, their conversation low but focused. He's still out there, one asked. The other nodded. Hasn't moved much. Does he know? A slight pause. I think he's starting to. The first nurse exhaled quietly. That's going to be a shift. Yes, the second replied. It already is. They returned to their tasks without further comment, because in that environment, shifts like that were not unusual. What mattered was how they resolved. Jose leaned back slightly, his posture no longer rigid but not relaxed. Uncertain. That was the word. For the first time, uncertainty had replaced certainty. Not completely, but enough to be noticed. He looked toward the doors again, not with the same expectation, with something else, something quieter, as if he were waiting not just for news, but for confirmation of what he wasn't sure. But the question had already formed, and once formed, it would not disappear. Inside, Alexandra completed the final adjustment. Check flow, she said. A pause, then stabilizing. Not perfect, but holding. She remained still for a moment longer than necessary, her eyes scanning, confirming, accounting for any variable that might still shift. Nothing immediate, nothing critical. She stepped back slightly. Not fully, not yet, but enough to signal transition. The most dangerous part had passed, not the entire procedure, but the point where failure was most likely. Bennett exhaled quietly, a release so subtle it might have gone unnoticed. Continue monitoring, Alexandra said. Her tone unchanged, because for her the work was not defined by the peak of tension, but by everything that followed. Outside, the waiting continued. Inside, the outcome moved closer to being decided. And between those two spaces, the truth, quiet, precise, and unavoidable, was already taking shape. The doors to Operating Room 2 remained closed, but the truth no longer did. It moved through the hospital in quieter ways, through staff who adjusted their tone when speaking Alexandra's name, through administrative notes that no longer needed clarification, through the absence of doubt in rooms where doubt had once existed. And eventually it reached Jose Alvarez in a form he could no longer dismiss. It came not as an announcement, but as confirmation. A hospital administrator approached him just after the 3rd hour. Measured steps, composed posture. The kind of presence that suggested both authority and restraint. "Mr. Alvarez," she said, "I'm here to provide an update." Jose stood immediately. Finally, he said the words sharper than intended. "What's happening? I've been waiting for someone to explain." "She is in surgery," the administrator replied, her tone steady, not interrupting, but not yielding either. "The procedure is ongoing." Jose nodded impatiently. "Yes, I know that. I need to know who's leading it." A brief pause. Not hesitation, precision. "Dr. Alexandra Reed is the attending surgeon on your mother's case." This time the words did not pass through him. They stopped, fully. Jose blinked once as if recalibrating. "That's not," he began, then stopped, because he had already heard it. From Alexandra herself, from the nurse, from the room that had aligned around her. But this was different. This was institutional, formal, irrefutable. Diane watched from her seat, her gaze shifting between Jose and the administrator, observing not the words, but their impact. Jose's expression changed not dramatically, but enough. The resistance remained, but something beneath it cracked. "She didn't tell me," he said finally. The administrator did not respond to that. It was not a statement that required confirmation or denial. It existed outside the scope of what mattered in that moment. "What are her chances?" Jose asked, his voice lower now. The administrator held his gaze. "Your mother is receiving the highest level of care available for her condition." It was not a percentage. It was not reassurance. It was accuracy. Jose exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering slightly. For the first time, the question was not about control. It was about outcome. And for the first time, the answer did not center him. Inside the operating room, Alexandra Reed adjusted her gloves. The most critical phase had passed, but the work was not complete. It never ended at the point where others believed it did. "Status," she said. "Stable," the anesthesiologist replied. "Holding." Alexandra nodded once her attention still fixed. "Begin closure sequence," she instructed. The team responded immediately. Each step followed the next without deviation. There was no shift in tone, no visible release of tension. Because for Alexandra, completion was not a moment. It was a process, and processes required consistency until the very end. Dr. Bennett remained in position observing, not as oversight alone, but as confirmation. He had seen the procedure unfold from beginning to near completion, and what he had seen aligned with expectation. Precision, control, no unnecessary motion, no hesitation. He did not speak. He didn't need to. The work spoke for itself. In the waiting area, silence settled more fully, not empty, but heavy. Jose sat again slower this time, as if his body had begun to match the weight of what his mind was processing. "She's the lead surgeon." He said the words quieter now. Diane nodded once. "Yes." He looked at her. "You knew." "I knew she was a surgeon," Diane replied. "I didn't know she would be the one handling this case. But it makes sense." Jose frowned slightly. Why Diane held his gaze. "Because she's good at what she does." The statement was simple, but it carried something Jose had not allowed himself to consider. Competence, not as an abstract concept, but as a defining reality. She never said anything, he repeated. Diane's expression did not change. She didn't need to. Jose looked away. That answer did not settle easily, because it suggested something else. That the absence of information was not the same as concealment. That what he had missed was not hidden. It had simply not been prioritized. By him. Down the hallway, Laura Whitman reviewed the updated incident file. The documentation had expanded. Witness statements now included multiple accounts of Jose's behavior in the restricted corridor. Timestamps aligned, descriptions matched. There was no ambiguity. She closed the file briefly, then reopened it, not out of uncertainty, out of thoroughness. Everything would be reviewed again, not for correction, for confirmation, because when the time came, it would not be enough to have the truth. It would need to be structured, clear, defensible, separate from emotion, separate from interpretation. That was how systems functioned. That was how accountability held. Back inside the operating room, Alexandra completed the final closure. "Dressings," she said. The last sequence moved quickly, efficiently, without complication. And then it was done. Not in a dramatic sense, not with a declaration, but with a shift. The monitors stabilized into a pattern that no longer required immediate correction. The team adjusted, stepping back slightly, not disengaging, but transitioning. Alexandra removed her gloves with the same precision she had applied to the procedure itself. No excess motion, no release of tension that suggested relief. Because relief was not the point. Outcome was. "She's stable," Bennett said quietly. Alexandra nodded once. No visible reaction, just acknowledgement. Because stability was not success, it was possibility. The doors opened nearly 15 minutes later. Not abruptly, not with urgency, but with intention. A nurse stepped into the waiting area, first, her presence signaling change. Jose stood immediately. Diane followed more slowly. "Mr. Alvarez," the nurse said. "Dr. Reed will be out shortly to speak with you." Jose nodded, his throat tightening slightly. For the first time, anticipation did not feel like control. It felt like uncertainty. And something else. Something quieter. Recognition, perhaps. Or the beginning of it. He looked toward the doors, waiting. Not for confirmation of what he already believed, but for something he had yet to fully understand. And inside, Alexandra Reed prepared to step into that space. Not as his wife. Not as someone to be questioned. But as the person who had just saved his mother's life. And who would now speak not to defend herself, but to state the outcome, clearly, precisely, without apology. When the doors opened again, they did not reveal everything at once. Hospitals rarely did. They released information in controlled measures, in carefully structured conversations that separated emotion from fact. The corridor outside Operating Room 2 remained still, as if the building itself understood that what came next required space. Alexandra Reed stepped through the last. She had changed again, not into something different, but into something more defined. The surgical gown was gone, replaced by a clean coat. Her hair secured her expression unchanged. There was no visible fatigue, no sign of the hours that had passed. Only clarity. Jose Alvarez stood before she reached him. Not rushed, not aggressive, but not still either. Something in him had shifted, though it had not settled into anything recognizable yet. Diane remained slightly behind her attention, fixed on Alexandra not with expectation, but with quiet acknowledgement. Alexandra stopped at a distance that preserved formality. Close enough to speak, far enough to remain separate. "Your mother is out of surgery," she said. Her voice was even, measured. The procedure addressed the aortic tear and reinforced the surrounding structure. "She is stable." The words were precise. They did not soften the situation. They did not dramatize it. They presented it. Jose absorbed them slowly. "Stable," he repeated. "Yes." There was a pause, a brief one, but it held more weight than anything that had been said before. "She's alive," he said. Alexandra met his gaze. "Yes." The confirmation did not change her tone. It did not carry relief. Because relief belonged to him, not to her. Jose exhaled a long, controlled breath that did not fully release the tension, but altered it enough to be felt. His shoulders lowered slightly, his posture less rigid. For a moment, nothing else mattered. Not the questions, not the contradictions, only the outcome. Diane stepped forward, then her voice softer. "Can we see her?" Alexandra nodded once. "She's being transferred to recovery. You'll be allowed in shortly, one at a time." Again, the phrasing was procedural, structured, not negotiable. Jose nodded, though his eyes remained on Alexandra, as if the conversation had not ended, as if something remained unresolved. "She would have died," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even directed fully at her. It was a realization, spoken aloud. Alexandra did not answer immediately. "Then yes." The words settled between them, clean, unembellished. Jose swallowed slightly, his gaze shifting for a moment before returning. "And you?" He stopped, because the sentence he had started did not have a simple ending. And Alexandra did not fill it for him. She waited, not expectantly, not impatiently, just long enough. "You did this," he said finally. Another pause, not for effect, for accuracy. "I performed the procedure," Alexandra replied. There was no claim in her tone, no assertion of ownership, just a statement of fact. Jose nodded slowly. The distinction should not have mattered. But it did, because it removed the possibility of framing the moment as something else, something personal, something emotional. It placed it where it belonged. In reality. "You didn't have to," he said. This time Alexandra responded without pause. "Yes, I did." Jose frowned slightly. Why the question came out quieter than his previous ones, less defensive, more uncertain. Alexandra held his gaze. "Because she was the patient in front of me," she said. "And I was the most qualified to operate." The answer did not include him. It did not include their relationship. It did not include anything beyond the structure of her role. Jose looked at her, searching for something else. Something that acknowledged him, that connected the outcome to the dynamic he understood. He found nothing. Diane watched the exchange carefully, not interrupting, not guiding, just observing the space between them as it reshaped itself. Jose shifted his weight slightly. "There are things we need to talk about," he said. Alexandra's expression did not change. "Not here," she replied. The words were not dismissive. They were directional. This was not the space for that conversation, and she would not allow it to become one. Jose hesitated, then nodded, not agreement, but recognition of a boundary he could not cross. A nurse approached, then her presence reintroducing the structure of the hospital into the moment. "She's being moved into recovery now," she said. "We can take one of you in." Diane looked at Jose. "You should go," she said. Jose didn't respond immediately. His attention remained on Alexandra, as if waiting for something more, some acknowledgement, some shift. But Alexandra had already given everything required. The outcome, the explanation, the boundary. There was nothing left to offer. Jose turned away first. He followed the nurse down the corridor, his steps slower than before, his posture less certain. Diane remained, for a moment. Then she looked at Alexandra. "Thank you," she said. The words were simple, but they carried something different. Not obligation, not expectation. Recognition. Alexandra inclined her head slightly, no more. Diane studied her for a moment longer. "You should get some rest," she added. Alexandra did not respond to that, because rest was not part of the immediate sequence. There were still notes to complete, reports to file, processes to close. Diane nodded once, as if understanding that, then turned and followed the path Jose had taken. Alexandra remained where she was. The corridor around her began to return to its normal rhythm. Staff moved with purpose, but without urgency. Conversations resumed at a measured pace. The moment intense as it had been folded back into the larger structure of the hospital. But its impact remained. Not visible, not spoken, but present. Alexandra turned slightly, her gaze moving toward the glass panel that reflected the corridor back at her. For a brief second, she saw herself as others might. Composed, controlled, unaffected. It was not entirely accurate, but it was sufficient. She stepped away from the reflection and moved down the hallway in the opposite direction. Not toward recovery, not toward the waiting area, toward the administrative wing, because the work, as always, extended beyond the visible moment. And what had begun here would not end with the surgery. Not for Jose, not for the system, and not for her. It would move forward, quietly, precisely, following the same principles that had guided every decision she had made. Clarity, structure, and the refusal to allow anything emotion, assumption, or expectation to alter what was already true. Recovery did not announce itself with certainty. It unfolded in increments, measured shifts in vitals, controlled responses to stimuli. A slow return from the suspended state that surgery required. Carmen Alvarez lay in the intensive care unit surrounded by that process, her condition stabilized but not secured. Machines translated her body into numbers, numbers that required interpretation, numbers that demanded attention. Alexandra Reed stood at the foot of the bed for a brief moment before stepping aside. She did not linger. She had already transitioned out of the role that required her presence here. Others would manage the recovery. Others would monitor, adjust, respond. That was how the system functioned. Not through ownership, through continuity. "ICU team has it," Nina Brooks said quietly beside her, her tone carrying both professionalism and familiarity. "They're stable for now." "For now," Alexandra repeated. It was not doubt. It was accuracy. Nina studied her for a second longer. "You handled it clean," Alexandra nodded once. It was contained. The distinction mattered. Handled suggested completion. Contained acknowledged that risk remained. Nina did not challenge the wording. She understood it. "Administration is asking for you," she added. "Conference room 3. Alexandra did not ask why. She already knew. In that room, the conversation did not begin with emotion. It began with documentation. Laura Whitman, sat at the head of the table, a file open in front of her, its contents already structured, categorized, and cross-referenced. Dr. Richard Bennett stood near the window, his posture relaxed but attentive. Alexandra entered without hesitation. "Have a seat," Laura said. Alexandra did. There was no delay, no attempt to soften the moment. "Before we proceed," Laura began, "I need to confirm your disclosure was complete and accurate." "It was," Alexandra replied. "Your marital relationship to the patient's son was not previously entered into the hospital's conflict of interest registry." "No. Reason I kept my personal and professional affiliations separate," Alexandra said. There was no prior clinical overlap. Laura made a note. "That separation is now documented," she said. "Going forward, it will remain so." Alexandra did not respond. She understood the implication. This was not a correction. It was a record. Bennett stepped forward slightly. "The procedure itself will be reviewed as standard," he said. "Not because of the relationship, but because of the case complexity." "I understand," Alexandra replied. "You'll submit a full report within 12 hours. "I will." The conversation remained direct, contained. But it did not end there. Laura closed the file in front of her, then opened another. This one thicker, more detailed. "We also need to address what occurred outside the operating room," she said. Alexandra remained still. Not defensive, not reactive, present. Multiple staff members documented interactions with Mr. Alvarez that interfered with restricted access protocols. Laura continued. "This includes attempts to override staff direction and verbal escalation within controlled zones." Alexandra did not interrupt. She did not need to. "Were you aware of these interactions at the time?" Laura asked. "Partially," Alexandra said. "Not in full detail." "Did any of his actions affect your clinical decision-making?" "No." "Did they delay care?" "None." Laura nodded once. That distinction is important because it separated outcome from behavior. One did not excuse the other, but they were not the same. "We will proceed with an internal review," Laura said. "This is standard when protocol is challenged in critical care environments." Alexandra inclined her head slightly. No objection, no agreement, just acknowledgement. Bennett's gaze shifted briefly toward her. "You maintained procedural integrity," he said. "That will be reflected in the report." Alexandra met his gaze. Understood. There was no gratitude in the exchange. Because this was not praise. It was confirmation. Outside the administrative wing, Jose Alvarez stood near the vending machines. He had not gone far, not physically, but mentally the distance had begun to form. He had seen his mother, briefly, long enough to confirm she was alive, long enough to see the machines, the lines, the controlled environment that surrounded her. Not long enough to speak, not long enough to feel resolution. Now, he stood alone. The earlier urgency had faded. In its place was something quieter, heavier. The absence of immediate crisis did not bring relief. It brought space. And space allowed thought. His phone vibrated again. Another notification. This time, he opened it without hesitation. The same account, the same flagged activity. But now, additional detail. A review request. Verification needed. Jose's expression tightened. He scrolled further. Transactions listed in sequence. Dates, amounts, patterns, not hidden, just unexamined. Until now. He closed the phone slowly, not dismissing it, not yet addressing it, just holding it. As if the weight of it had changed. Because it had. For the first time, the things he had kept separate. His finances, his assumptions, his version of events no longer felt contained. They began to overlap, to connect, not clearly, but enough. Diane approached, then her steps measured. "She's stable," she said. Jose nodded. I know. Diane studied him for a moment. You should go home, she added. Get some rest. Jose shook his head. I'm not leaving. Diane didn't argue. She simply shifted her gaze slightly. Then you should think about what happens next. Jose frowned. What do you mean? Diane held his gaze. I mean, this doesn't end here. The statement was not a warning. It was observation. Jose looked away because he understood. Even if he did not yet accept it, back inside the hospital, Alexandra exited the conference room. The hallway stretched ahead, familiar in its structure, unchanged in its function. But the day had altered something within it. Not visibly, not permanently, but enough. She walked without pause, her steps aligned with the rhythm she had always followed. There were still reports to complete, still processes to close, still clarity to maintain. Because for Alexandra Reed, the end of a procedure was not the end of responsibility. It was a transition, and transitions required the same precision as everything else. Behind her, conversations continued. Reviews began, records expanded, and in each of those, the truth structure, documented and increasingly unavoidable, moved forward. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the same quiet certainty that had guided her all along. And this time, it would not remain unseen. Morning in the ICU arrived without sunlight. It came through numbers. Carmen Alvarez's chart updated in steady intervals, each entry marking a small, measurable change. Blood pressure held within a tighter range. Oxygen saturation stabilized. The irregular fluctuations that had defined the first hours after surgery began to soften into something more predictable. Not safe, not yet, but no longer immediate. Nina Brooks stood at the station reviewing the latest updates when Alexandra Reed approached. The transition from night to morning had not altered Alexandra's pace. Her movements remained consistent, her attention precise. Status, Alexandra asked. Stable overnight, Nina replied. No acute complications. They're responding to sedation adjustments. Alexandra nodded once. Neurological response limited, but present. They'll begin lightening sedation in a few hours. Alexandra reviewed the chart herself, scanning each line without hesitation. Not searching for reassurance, confirming structure. She'll need monitoring for delayed complications, she said. Watch for pressure shifts. Already flagged, Nina replied. There was no further discussion. There didn't need to be. The system was functioning, and Alexandra trusted it. Jose Alvarez did not trust systems, not when they operated without him. He had returned to the hospital earlier than necessary, earlier than advised. The waiting area was quieter now, less crowded, the urgency of the previous day replaced by a slower, more controlled pace. He stood near the entrance to the ICU corridor, his hands at his sides, his posture uncertain. He had slept. Not well. Just enough to move through the next sequence of hours. When Diane arrived, she found him there. You're early, she said. Jose glanced at her briefly. Couldn't stay home. Diane nodded. She understood that, even if she understood more than he did. They'll let you in soon, she added. Jose nodded again. Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, but not resolved. After a moment, Jose spoke. They're reviewing me, he said. Diane turned slightly. What do you mean yesterday? He replied. The things I said. The way I tried to get in. They documented it. Diane's expression did not change. That's standard, she said. Jose exhaled slowly. It doesn't feel standard. Diane held his gaze. That's because you're not used to being on that side of it. The words landed cleanly, not as criticism, as fact. Jose looked away, because again, she wasn't wrong. In another part of the hospital, Laura Whitman continued her review. The file had grown overnight, Statements confirmed. Timelines aligned. Audio fragments from the corridor added context, even if incomplete. Enough to establish pattern. Enough to remove ambiguity. She did not rush the process, because accuracy mattered more than speed. Every detail had to hold, not just in isolation, but in structure. She paused at one entry. A nurse's account, clear, consistent with the others. She cross-referenced it with a timestamp, matched. Then with the access logs, also matched. Laura closed the file briefly, then reopened it, not because she doubted, because she confirmed. That was how systems maintained integrity. Through repetition, through verification, through the refusal to assume anything without support. Alexandra finished her review and stepped away from the ICU station. She did not enter Carmen's room. Not yet. Her role in this phase was limited, deliberately so. Distance ensured clarity, and clarity ensured that nothing personal interfered with what needed to remain objective. As she turned into the hallway, she saw Jose. He stood near the corridor entrance, his posture shifting slightly as their eyes met. This time, he did not approach immediately. He hesitated, only for a second. But enough. Alexandra stopped at a measured distance. Not close, not distant, appropriate. "She's stable," she said. The update was simple, direct. Jose nodded. "I know," he replied. "They told me." There was a pause, longer than the previous ones, not filled with urgency, but with something else. Adjustment. Jose shifted his weight slightly. "They're reviewing what happened yesterday," he said. Alexandra did not react. She had expected that. "Yes," she said. Jose looked at her, searching for something in her expression. Understanding. Reaction. Anything. He found none. "I didn't know," he said. The words came out quieter than before, less defensive, more uncertain. Alexandra held his gaze. "I understand," she replied. The statement was not forgiving, not dismissive. It was simply accurate. Jose frowned slightly. "That's it?" he asked. Alexandra did not answer immediately. "Then, what else would you like me to say?" The question was not confrontational. It was precise. Jose opened his mouth to respond, then stopped, because he did not have an answer. Not one that fit, not one that held. He began. Then paused again, because the sentence did not complete itself, because what he wanted to return the situation to something familiar was no longer possible. Alexandra waited, not for explanation, but for clarity. When it did not come, she spoke. "The review will proceed," she said. "It's separate from your mother's care." Jose nodded slowly. "I figured." Another pause. Then, "There are other things," he said. Alexandra's expression remained unchanged. "What kind of things?" Jose hesitated. For the first time, the uncertainty was visible, not just in his posture, in his words. "My accounts," he said. They flagged something. Alexandra did not react, not outwardly, but she registered it, as she registered everything. "What did they flag?" she asked. Jose shook his head slightly. "I don't know yet. Just unusual activity." Alexandra held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once. That should be addressed. The response was neutral, procedural. Jose looked at her, something shifting again. "You're not surprised," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was observation. Alexandra did not answer immediately. "Then I review details," she said. The statement was simple, but it carried weight. Jose understood that. Not fully, but enough. Because suddenly, the separation he had maintained between what he said, what he did, what he assumed no one noticed, did not feel intact. It felt observed, documented, structured, and that realization did not come with volume. It came quietly, but it settled deeply. Diane approached, then her presence rebalancing the moment. "They're ready for visitors," she said. Jose nodded, relieved perhaps to shift focus, to move away from the conversation that had begun to narrow around him. He looked at Alexandra once more, as if expecting something. A closing remark, a signal. There was none. Alexandra stepped back slightly, returning the space, returning the structure. "Go see her," she said. Jose did, and as he walked past her, the distance between what he had believed and what he now faced continued to expand. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. With the same quiet certainty that had defined everything Alexandra Reed had done. And this time, there was no version of events that could reduce it. The hospital's administrative wing did not change with the pace of patient care. It moved differently, more slowly on the surface, more deliberately underneath. Files did not rush. They accumulated. They aligned. They built weight through consistency rather than urgency. What happened in hallways and waiting areas eventually arrived here, stripped of tone, reduced to sequence, and examined for structure. Alexandra Reed sat across from a legal associate she had met only once before. Daniel Harper specialized in domestic financial reviews, tied to professional liability. His approach matched the environment, precise, contained, and entirely focused on documentation. He did not begin with questions. He began with organization. "These are the materials you provided," he said, sliding a structured folder across the table. "I've categorized them into communication, financial records, and timeline correlations." Alexandra glanced down briefly. Everything was where it should be. Emails printed with headers intact. Message threads preserved without gaps. Transaction summaries aligned with calendar entries. No exaggeration, no omission. "Is anything missing?" Daniel asked. "No." "Then we proceed." He opened the first section. "Communication," he said. "This establishes pattern." He turned a page. "Repeated requests from Mr. Alvarez for you to reduce working hours. Language shifts over time from suggestion to expectation." Another page. "Instances of dismissal regarding your professional obligations." Another. Tone becomes increasingly directive, so Daniel looked up. "This matters," he said. "Not for interpretation, for sequence." Alexandra nodded once, because she understood. This was not about proving emotion. It was about establishing consistency. "And you never responded in kind," Daniel added. "I responded minimally," Alexandra said. "Documented," he replied. He closed the section and moved to the next. Financial records. The folder here was thicker, not chaotic, structured. Because Alexandra had made it so. "Joint accounts show regular withdrawals," Daniel said. "Within expected range initially." He flipped forward. "Then variance increases." Another page. "Secondary account appears." He paused briefly. "This account is not listed in shared disclosures." Alexandra remained still. "Correct," Daniel continued. "Transactions from this account correspond with periods where joint funds decrease unexpectedly." He placed a separate sheet on top. A correlation chart. Dates aligned. Amounts matched. Patterns emerged. Not dramatic, but clear. "Do you have direct access to this account?" he asked. "No. Knowledge of its existence prior to documentation." "Yes." "Did you confront him, Nora?" Daniel nodded once. "Then this remains uncontested data." Because it had not been argued. It had not been reframed. It existed as it was. He moved to the final section. Timeline. This one connected everything. Communication, financial movement, behavioral shifts. "Key point," Daniel said. "Yesterday's incident." He turned the page. Public behavior in a controlled medical environment. Alexandra's expression did not change. Multiple witness statements, Daniel continued. Consistent language patterns with prior communication. He looked up. This extends the pattern into a professional setting. Not separate, connected. Alexandra inclined her head slightly. Yes. Daniel closed the file. From a legal standpoint, this is not complex, he said. It is structured because nothing in it relied on interpretation. Everything relied on record. We will proceed with formal separation documentation, he added. Asset protection, liability clarification, and financial disentanglement. Alexandra did not respond immediately. Then timeline initial filing within 48 hours, Daniel said. Full process depended on response. Alexandra nodded. That was sufficient. Elsewhere in the hospital, Laura Whitman reviewed the compliance report. It had reached the stage where summary could be written. Not conclusions, not yet, but structure. She dictated quietly. Subject engaged in repeated verbal escalation within restricted medical zones. Attempts to override staff directives were documented at multiple points. She paused, then continued. Behavior did not result in direct clinical interference. However, it introduced disruption to controlled communication pathways. She stopped again. Because wording mattered, not for effect, for accuracy. She reviewed the lines once more. No exaggeration, no omission. Then saved the file. It would move forward, as all structured things did. In the ICU, Carmen Alvarez opened her eyes. Not fully, not for long, but enough. The light above her blurred, then sharpened slightly. Shapes formed at the edge of perception. Sound returned in fragments. A voice, low, measured, familiar, Mom Jose. She turned her head slightly, the movement slow, constrained by everything that still surrounded her. Machines, lines, structure. Jose leaned forward, his expression caught between relief and uncertainty. She made it, he said, more to himself than to her. Carmen's gaze shifted, not to him, past him, to the doorway, where Alexandra stood. Not inside the room, not approaching, observing, from a distance that maintained clarity. Carmen's eyes held there for a moment. Recognition moved through them, not of role, of reality. Then they closed again. The effort required had been enough. Jose followed her gaze. He turned, saw Alexandra. For a second, nothing happened. Then, "She saw you," he said. Alexandra did not respond, because it did not require response. Jose stepped out into the hallway, leaving the ICU room behind him. "She looked at you," he repeated. Alexandra met his gaze. "Yes." Jose hesitated, as if the moment required something more. Gratitude, acknowledgement, something that aligned with what he now understood. But Alexandra did not shift the structure. She did not step into that space, because that space was not where the truth had been built. "It doesn't change anything," she said. The words were quiet, not cold, not dismissive, just precise. Jose frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Alexandra held his gaze. "The outcome is the outcome," she said. "The rest remains." Jose absorbed that, slowly, because it separated things he had begun to connect. Her action, their relationship, her silence, his assumptions. They were not the same. They had never been the same. And now they would not be allowed to merge. "There's going to be a review," he said. "Yes, and legal, yes." The answers came without hesitation, because they had already been decided. Not emotionally, structurally. Jose looked at her. For the first time, not searching for control, not expecting alignment, just looking. As if trying to understand something that had always been present and always been overlooked. Alexandra stepped back slightly, not retreating, repositioning. because the conversation had reached its boundary, and she did not extend beyond it. Focus on her recovery, she said. Jose nodded, because for now that was the only part of the situation he could still hold without uncertainty. He turned back toward the ICU room, and Alexandra walked in the opposite direction, toward the administrative wing, toward the processes already in motion, toward the structure that would carry everything forward, without noise, without spectacle, only with the same clarity that had defined every step before. And this time, nothing would be left unrecorded. Carmen Alvarez did not recover all at once. She returned in fragments. Awareness came first in brief intervals that did not always connect, then recognition slower, more selective. Pain followed managed but present, grounding her in a body that was no longer as certain as it had been. Time for her moved differently now, measured not by hours, but by what she could hold in memory without losing it. On the third day, she remained awake long enough to speak. The ICU room was quieter than before. Machines still marked her condition, but the urgency had softened. What remained was vigilance. Jose stood beside the bed, his posture uncertain in a way that had become more familiar over the past 48 hours. "You're okay," he said, though the statement carried more hope than certainty. Carmen's eyes shifted toward him. "I'm here," she replied, her voice low, controlled by effort. The words cost her. Jose leaned closer. "You don't have to talk." Carmen studied him for a moment, not with emotion, with assessment. "What happened?" she asked. Jose hesitated, because the answer had changed. Not, in fact, in meaning. "You had a tear in your aorta," he said. "They operated." Carmen nodded slightly, and Jose swallowed. "And you made it." Carmen's gaze remained steady. "That's not what I asked." The distinction settled between them. Jose looked away briefly, then back. "Alexandra was the surgeon," he said. The words came out without resistance, because resistance no longer held. Carmen did not react immediately. Then slowly, her gaze shifted toward the doorway. It was empty, but she did not seem surprised. "She didn't come in," she said. Jose shook his head. "She checked earlier, from outside." Carmen's expression did not change. She would, not as praise, as recognition. Jose watched her carefully. "You knew?" he asked. Carmen's eyes moved back to him. "No," she said. "I didn't know." A pause. "Then I just didn't see." The difference mattered. And for the first time, Carmen acknowledged it. Later that afternoon, Diane Alvarez stood in the hallway outside the ICU, reviewing a printed report she had requested from the administrative desk. Not medical, procedural. She did not read it all. She didn't need to. The structure was clear enough. She looked up as Jose approached. "They're reviewing you," she said. Jose nodded. "I know." Diane studied him, and Jose exhaled slowly. "I don't think it's going away." Diane folded the report. "No," she said. "It's not." Jose leaned against the wall, his posture no longer defensive, just tired. "I didn't think it mattered," he said. "What didn't?" Diane asked. "The way I spoke, the way I handled things." Diane held his gaze. "In most places, it might not," she said. "Here it does. Because here, everything was recorded. Everything had consequence. Not immediate, but eventual." Jose nodded slightly. "I see that now." Diane did not respond, because seeing was not the same as understanding. And understanding was not the same as change. In the administrative wing, Laura Whitman finalized the compliance summary. It was not long. It did not need to be. Clarity did not require length. Subjects' actions constituted a breach of hospital conduct protocols within restricted areas. Behavior included repeated verbal escalation and non-compliance with staff directives. She paused, then added, "No direct impact on clinical outcome observed. However, conduct introduced measurable disruption to operational flow." She reviewed the statement once more. No exaggeration, no mitigation. Then saved the document. It would move forward, as part of a system that did not forget. Alexandra Reed reviewed the legal draft in silence. Daniel Harper had completed the initial filing. It was structured the same way everything else had been. Clear, sequential, supported. Assets are separated based on documented contribution, Daniel said. Liabilities assigned accordingly. Alexandra scanned the page. Every figure aligned, every statement referenced. "Response timeline?" she asked. "Once served, he has a fixed window," Daniel replied. "Delays are limited." Alexandra nodded. "Proceed." There was no hesitation, because nothing in the document required reconsideration. It reflected what already existed, in record, in pattern, in structure. Back in the ICU, Carmen asked for Alexandra. Not immediately, not urgently, but clearly. Nina Brooks noted the request and relayed it. Alexandra did not go right away. She finished what she was doing, completed the sequence in front of her, then walked toward the ICU. Not quickly, not slowly, with the same measured pace. When she entered the room, Carmen was awake. Fully this time, her gaze steady, her posture supported by the systems around her, but her presence no longer fragmented. Alexandra stopped at the foot of the bed, not approaching further, maintaining the same distance she had before. "You asked for me," Alexandra said. Carmen studied her, longer than necessary, long enough to register not just her presence, but her position. "You operated," Carmen said. "Yes." The answer was simple, without weight. Carmen nodded slightly. "You didn't have to." Alexandra did not respond immediately. Then, "Yes, I did." The same answer she had given Jose, because the reasoning had not changed. Carmen's gaze remained fixed. "Not for me," she said. Alexandra held her gaze. "For the patient," she replied. The distinction settled, not gently, but clearly. Carmen exhaled slowly. It cost her. But she did not look away. "I was wrong about you," she said. The words were not dramatic. They were not softened. They were stated as fact. Alexandra did not respond, because the statement did not require acceptance or rejection. It existed. Carmen continued. "I thought silence meant distance." A pause. I didn't understand what it was. Alexandra remained still. "Then you understood what you chose to," she said. Not harsh, not forgiving, accurate. Carmen closed her eyes briefly. Not in dismissal, in acknowledgement. When she opened them again, her gaze was clearer. "What happens now?" she asked. Alexandra did not hesitate. "The same processes that were already in motion," she said. Carmen absorbed that. Slowly. "Jose," she asked. Alexandra's expression did not change. "He will be part of that," she said. Nothing more. Because nothing more was required, Carmen nodded once. Not in agreement, in recognition, that what had been set in motion would continue, regardless of personal understanding, regardless of regret. Alexandra stepped back slightly. The conversation had reached its boundary, and she did not extend beyond it. Carmen watched her, not with expectation, not with judgment, just watching. As Alexandra turned and walked out of the room, without pause, without looking back. And in that movement, something settled. Not resolution, not closure, but truth, clear, structured, and no longer avoidable. By the fourth day, the hospital had returned to its usual rhythm. Not because anything had resolved, because systems do not wait for resolution. They continue, Charts updated. Rounds proceeded. Admissions replaced discharges. The same corridors carried different stories, none of them pausing long enough to absorb another. But within that continuity, certain processes moved forward with quiet precision. They did not need attention. They required completion. Alexandra Reed stood in conference room 3 again this time, with a different set of documents in front of her. Final drafts, not summaries, not preliminary reviews. Documents prepared for execution. Daniel Harper sat across from her, his tone unchanged from their previous meeting. "Service will be completed today," he said. "Delivery is scheduled through registered channels. Confirmation will be logged." Alexandra glanced at the top page. Petition for dissolution, clear, direct. No additional language. "Financial separation is already structured," Daniel continued. "No shared liabilities beyond those documented. The secondary account will be addressed during a review." Alexandra nodded once. "Timeline after service response window begins immediately," Daniel replied. "If contested proceedings extend, if not, resolution remains contained." Contained. The word fit. Everything about this process had been contained. Not hidden, structured. Alexandra closed the folder. "Proceed." There was no hesitation, because nothing within it required reconsideration. Daniel gathered the documents, aligning them with the same precision Alexandra applied to everything else. "This will move forward regardless of response," he said. Alexandra did not respond. She understood. The process did not depend on agreement, only on structure. Elsewhere in the hospital, Laura Whitman finalized the compliance action notice. It was not punitive, not in tone, but in effect it carried consequence. "Subject is formally notified of conduct review findings," she dictated. "Further access to restricted medical areas will require adherence to updated supervision protocols." She paused, then added, "Any future violations will result in escalated administrative action. Clear, defensible, enforceable." She reviewed the language once more. No ambiguity. Then sent it forward. Jose Alvarez received both notifications within the same hour. The timing was not coordinated. It did not need to be. Processes aligned naturally when they followed structure. He stood near the hospital parking structure when his phone vibrated. The first message was from an unknown number. Official. He opened it, read the subject line. "Petition for dissolution of marriage." The words did not register immediately, not in meaning, only in form. He read further. Names, dates, details he recognized, then details he did not. Financial breakdowns, account references, the secondary account. He stopped reading, not because he was finished, because the sequence had shifted. He opened the second message. Hospital compliance notice, shorter, more direct. Summary of behavior, findings, conditions. Jose exhaled slowly, not sharply, not with anger, just release. Because both documents carried the same underlying structure. They did not accuse, they did not argue. They presented, and what they presented could not be reframed. He leaned against the concrete wall, the cool surface grounding him in a way the moment itself did not. For the first time, there was no immediate response, no argument forming, no narrative to adjust. Only the recognition that everything he had assumed to be flexible was not. Inside the ICU, Carmen Alvarez had been moved to a step-down unit. Progress measured, controlled. She sat slightly upright now, supported but more aware her presence no longer fragmented. Diane sat beside her, reviewing a chart she only partially understood. "They say you're improving," Diane said. Carmen nodded. "I am." Her voice remained low, but steadier. Diane glanced at her. "You've been quiet." Carmen looked ahead. I've been thinking. Diane did not press. She didn't need to. Carmen continued. I thought I understood people, she said. I thought I knew what to look for. A pause. I didn't. Diane followed her gaze. You saw what you expected to see, she said. Carmen nodded once. Yes, because expectation had shaped perception, and perception had shaped judgment. Alexandra had not changed. Only Carmen's ability to see her had. Alexandra did not return to the ICU that afternoon, not because she avoided it, because it was no longer required. Her role had shifted fully out of that space. Instead, she completed her final report. Procedure details, timeline, decision points. Each section written with the same clarity she applied in practice. No excess language, no interpretation, only what occurred and why. She reviewed it once, then submitted it, complete. Late afternoon, the hospital lobby filled with the soft movement of people transitioning out of the day, visitors leaving, staff rotating. The building exhaled in its own way. Alexandra walked through it without pause, her pace unchanged, her attention forward. She did not look for Jose. She did not need to. He was there, near the entrance, not waiting, not pacing, standing, as if the movement around him did not quite include him anymore. When he saw her, he did not approach immediately. He watched her cross the space, measured, controlled. The same way she had moved through every moment, he now understood differently. When she reached the doors, he spoke. Alexandra. She stopped, turned, maintained distance. Yes. Jose held the phone in his hand, the screen dark now. I received the documents, he said. Alexandra nodded. Yes. No explanation. No justification, because none was required. Jose hesitated. Then you already knew, he said. It wasn't a question. It was recognition. Alexandra met his gaze. I review details, she replied. The same answer, because it remained accurate. Jose exhaled. There's no room to change this, he said. Alexandra did not answer immediately. Then it's already structured, she said. The words settled. Final. Not harsh, not emotional, just complete. Jose nodded slowly, because he understood. Not everything. But enough. Enough to see that the process had moved beyond conversation, beyond adjustment, into something that did not rely on him. Alexandra turned back toward the doors, then paused. Not long. Just enough. Your mother's recovery will continue, she said. Focus there. Jose nodded. I will. This time the answer carried no resistance, because it was the only part of the situation that still remained open. Alexandra stepped outside. The city air met her without change, the same as it had always been, the same as it would remain. Behind her, the hospital continued. Processes moving, records holding, outcomes settling into place. And for the first time, nothing within that structure depended on silence being misunderstood. Everything had been seen, everything had been recorded, and everything would proceed, exactly as it was. Chicago did not mark endings. It absorbed them. Traffic continued. Lights changed. Buildings held their shape against the sky as if nothing within them had shifted. Whatever concluded inside offices, hospital rooms, or private conversations rarely left visible traces. But structure remained, and structure carried consequence forward. Carmen Alvarez left the hospital 11 days after her surgery, not fully recovered, but stable enough to transition. Discharge was not a release. It was a continuation in a different setting. Instructions were detailed, follow-up appointments scheduled, medications structured into precise intervals. Recovery would depend not on a single moment, but on adherence. Diane handled most of the coordination. She asked the questions, clarified timelines, confirmed details. Jose stood nearby, present, but not leading. When the final paperwork was signed, Carmen looked toward the doorway, not expecting Alexandra, just aware of the absence. "She won't come," Carmen said quietly. Diane glanced at her. "No," she replied, "she won't." Carmen nodded once, because she understood. Some distances were not created by conflict. They were defined by clarity. The compliance review concluded without escalation. Not because the behavior had been minimized, because it had been contained within documented boundaries. Jose received formal notice, conditions, expectations, limitations on access moving forward. He read it carefully, this time without dismissal, because he had learned that structure did not bend to reaction. It held. The legal process moved with the same quiet precision. Service completed, response window opened. Jose reviewed the documents more than once, not searching for error, understanding alignment. Everything matched. Dates, records, accounts. There was no space to argue interpretation, because interpretation had not been used. Only documentation. He met with his own counsel, sat across from a man who spoke in the same language Alexandra had chosen. Structure, sequence, outcome. "You can contest," the attorney said, "but the record is consistent." Jose nodded. He already knew. "Or you can proceed without dispute," the attorney continued. "Resolution will be faster." Faster did not mean easier, but it meant contained. Jose exhaled slowly. "I'll proceed," he said. The decision was not dramatic. It did not carry relief. But it was clear. Alexandra Reed did not attend any of those meetings. She did not need to. Her presence existed in the documents, in the records, in the structure that had already been established. Instead, she returned to her work. The hospital did not pause for personal transitions, neither did she. Her schedule filled as it always had. Cases assigned, procedures performed, reports completed. Her name continued to move through the system in the same quiet way, recognized, relied upon, not announced. One afternoon, weeks later, Alexandra stood at the same scrubbed sink she had used countless times before. Water ran steadily over her hands. The motion unchanged, the process identical. Across from her, a resident observed carefully mirroring each movement with less certainty. "You don't rush this part," Alexandra said. The resident nodded. "Yes, doctor. Precision starts before the procedure," she added, "not during." The resident adjusted slightly, correcting, learning. Alexandra turned off the water, dried her hands, moved forward. Because forward was the only direction that maintained clarity. Carmen's recovery progressed slowly. There were setbacks, moments of fatigue, pain that returned without warning. But she followed the structure given to her. Not perfectly, but consistently, Diane remained involved, present in a way that did not impose. Jose visited regularly, not with the same certainty he once carried, but with intention, measured. He spoke less, listened more, not as transformation, as adjustment. Carmen noticed, but did not comment, because some changes did not require acknowledgement, only continuation. The finalization of the legal process came without ceremony. Documents signed, filed, confirmed. No confrontation, no closing argument, only completion. Jose read the final notice once, then set it aside. There was nothing left to respond to. Everything had already been addressed. Weeks later, their paths crossed one last time. Not planned, not arranged. In the hospital lobby. Alexandra moved through the space as she always did, focused, uninterrupted. Jose stood near the seating area, reviewing something on his phone. He looked up, saw her. For a moment, neither moved. Then Jose stepped forward, not quickly, not hesitantly, just forward. Alexandra. She stopped, turned, maintained distance. Yes. There was no tension in her posture, no expectation, just presence. Jose held her gaze, not searching this time, not questioning. I signed everything he said. Alexandra nodded once. I know. Because of course she did. Structure confirmed completion. Jose exhaled slowly. I wanted to say... He began, then paused. Because the words did not come easily, not in the way they once had. Thank you, he said finally. The phrase was simple, but it carried weight. Not for the surgery alone, for everything he now understood differently. Alexandra held his gaze. For a moment. Then you're welcome. The response matched the structure. Acknowledgement, nothing more. Jose nodded, because that was all there was. No reconciliation, no return, only recognition. Alexandra turned, continued toward the exit, her steps unchanged, her pace consistent, the same as it had always been. Jose watched her go, not with regret alone, not with clarity fully formed, but with understanding, incomplete, yet real. Outside, the city moved as it always did, unaware, unchanged. Alexandra stepped into it without hesitation, the air cool, the light steady, nothing marking the transition except the absence of what had been. She did not look back, because there was nothing behind her that required reconsideration. Everything had been addressed, structured, completed. She moved forward, not towards something new, toward what had always been hers, clarity, precision, and the quiet certainty that did not need to be seen to hold its place. There are moments in life that do not arrive with noise, no raised voices, no dramatic turning point that announces itself clearly, just a shift, quiet, exact, unavoidable. What happened in that hospital was not about a single act of saving a life. It was about what had been present long before that moment. The difference between what is seen and what is assumed. The cost of speaking without understanding. The weight of silence that is mistaken for absence. Alexandra did not change in that moment. She revealed consistency. She remained who she had always been, precise, observant, and unwilling to distort truth for comfort. And when everything was finally placed under the same light, records, actions, words, there was no need for confrontation, no need for revenge. Only structure, only outcome. Jose did not lose everything at once. He saw it piece by piece. Not through punishment, but through clarity. And sometimes that is the only form of justice that lasts. If you've stayed with this story until the end, you already understand something important. Not every strength is loud. Not every boundary is spoken. And not every truth needs to be defended to remain true. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to share where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Stories like this travel quietly across places and lives, connecting people who understand more than they say. And if you want to continue exploring stories about dignity, truth, and quiet strength, you can stay connected here. No pressure, just presence.